What if everything you thought you knew was a lie? What if the threat you never saw coming was hiding in plain sight, playing you like a puppet? Tom Cruise was just enjoying a quiet evening when a robbery turned his world upside down. 7 minutes later, he stopped a deadly crime, but what if that was just the beginning? What if the real danger wasn't the criminals in front of him, but the unseen force pulling their strings from the shadows? He thought he'd saved innocent lives. He was wrong. And now the countdown to chaos has begun. Tom Cruise sat at a table near the window of an upscale restaurant, the warm golden light of the evening sun casting soft shadows across the room. He was dressed casually. No suit, no flashy jacket, just a simple button-down shirt and jeans. His presence was a quiet contrast to the usual crowd, full of business tycoons and their guests, talking about investments and politics. The place was bustling with energy, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Tom was here for a low-key dinner with an old friend, a former Navy SEAL named Jack, who had invited him for a drink. Nothing major, no cameras, no attention. The restaurant was cozy, with its dim lights and dark wood floors. Tom had almost forgotten the hectic pace of his usual life. Jack and he talked about everything and nothing. They laughed about their old missions, reminiscing about adventures from years ago. Jack's stories were louder than Tom's, filled with the excitement of someone who had never quite let go of the adrenaline rush. Tom, however, enjoyed the calm. It felt good to sit and chat without being pulled in 1,000 directions. In the corner, a woman sat alone, nervously tapping her fingers on her wine glass. She glanced up every few seconds, looking out the window as if waiting for someone. Her attire, a simple dress, seemed out of place in a room full of suits. Tom noticed her, but only for a moment. He returned his attention to Jack, who was mid-story about a wild encounter they had in Tokyo, but his mind kept wandering back to the woman. There was something about her that felt off. Maybe it was just the way she kept checking her watch. But Tom couldn't shake the feeling. He had learned over the years to trust that feeling, the instinct that something was wrong, even if he couldn't put his finger on it. He turned his attention back to Jack, who was in the middle of explaining how he had once chased down a thief on a motorcycle. Just as Jack was about to hit the climax of his story, a sudden crash interrupted everything. The door to the restaurant burst open with a force that made everyone turn. A man dressed in black with a ski mask rushed in, followed by two more figures. They were armed, their guns pointed towards the ceiling. The restaurant went silent in an instant. The woman in the corner stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't been alone. There was a man at her table, but his face was obscured by the hood of his jacket. The three robbers didn't seem to care. They moved quickly, barking orders at the staff and patrons alike. One of them, the leader, stood near the door, scanning the room, his eyes sharp as he surveyed the crowd. The others moved to the center, guns raised, shouting for everyone to get down. Tom didn't move. He froze, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't used to this. This wasn't a movie or some staged confrontation. It was real, and it was happening right in front of him. His first instinct was to act, to do something. But his experience told him that making the wrong move could make things worse. The leader shouted, "Everyone on the ground now." His voice was strained, his grip on the gun tight. There was something off about him, nervous, desperate. It wasn't just about the robbery. Something more was going on. Tom could sense it. His gaze flicked back to the woman in the corner, who was now visibly trembling. Her hand clutched a small child, her face pale with fear. Tom's instincts screamed at him. The woman, the child. Who were they? What was their connection to this? One of the robbers, the younger one, was pacing around the room, more agitated than the rest. He kept shouting at the hostages to stay down, his words almost incoherent. The other, a slightly older man, kept looking at the door as if waiting for someone to show up. Tom couldn't place it, but the entire situation felt wrong. Jack, sitting across from Tom, seemed to have gone rigid as well. He wasn't moving either, but there was a knowing look in his eyes. They'd both been in situations like this before, but not with innocent people in the crossfire. Then, there was a loud bang. One of the robbers, the unstable one, had fired a shot into the air. The noise was deafening in the silence that followed. A woman screamed, Someone collapsed on the floor, clutching their stomach. Chaos erupted instantly. Chairs toppled over. The other patrons scrambled, trying to get as far from the robbers as possible. Tom's hand instinctively went to his side, feeling for the concealed weapon he always carried. But even as his fingers brushed the cool metal, he hesitated. This wasn't about heroics. This wasn't about saving the day. This was real, and his next move would decide everything. He glanced back at the woman and child. The child was crying, her face twisted in terror. The mother's eyes locked with Tom's for a split second, a silent plea for help. In that moment, Tom knew one thing. He couldn't just sit here and wait. Not this time, but how? How could he make a move without making things worse? The robbers were panicking. The leader kept shouting at everyone to stay down, his voice cracking as he tried to control the room. The younger one, looking more and more unstable, waved his gun erratically, scanning the room for any signs of resistance. Tom was watching all of this unfold, his mind racing. The seconds felt like hours. Every move he made, no matter how small, could change everything. The moment was slipping away, and Tom knew he had to act before it was too late. The next few seconds would be the difference between life and death for these people. But how much risk was he willing to take? The tense silence that followed the gunshot felt like a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room. Tom's heart raced, and his muscles tensed. He could feel the weight of the moment, each second dragging on like it might be his last. The woman's grip on the child tightened, her face pale and full of fear. The child's cries echoed through the restaurant, a painful reminder of what was at stake. Tom's eyes flicked to Jack, who had a calculating look in his eyes. They'd both been in similar situations, but never like this. Never with innocent lives so directly on the line. The robbers, sensing their control was slipping, grew more frantic. The leader barked orders at everyone to stay down, his voice growing higher and more desperate with every word. "Get on the ground, now!" he screamed, his finger twitching on the trigger. The younger, more nervous robber took a step forward. His gun still raised, but his hands were shaking. Tom could see the panic in his eyes, the uncertainty. He was just a kid who had gotten himself in way too deep. A loud crash broke the momentary silence as the younger robber knocked over a stack of chairs, his face flushed with frustration. He looked at the leader for guidance, but the leader wasn't paying attention. His eyes were fixed on the woman in the corner, the one who had been waiting by the window. The leader's gaze lingered on her longer than it should have, and Tom couldn't help but wonder if he knew something about her, or if she was just another victim caught in the crossfire. The woman's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The child was still crying, and Tom's mind raced. He couldn't just wait around forever. He needed to move. But the problem was, he had no idea how the robbers were planning to leave. Were they planning to hold everyone hostage? Would they just grab the cash and run? Or worse, were they waiting for something else? Before he could make any decisions, the situation took another turn for the worse. The unstable robber, clearly losing his nerve, shoved someone aside, shouting at them to stay down. His voice wavered with panic as he swung the gun in wild arcs, his gaze darting around the room. His erratic movements only made things worse. In his panic, he turned the gun toward the woman in the corner, who was still trying to calm her child. "Get your hands up! Get them up!" the unstable robber screamed, his voice cracking. Tom's pulse quickened. He could see the woman's hands trembling as she slowly lifted them, her eyes locked in terror on the man holding the gun. Tom could feel his own breath catch in his throat. This was the moment. This was the breaking point. If the unstable robber fired, everything would spiral out of control. He could already see it in his mind, the chaos, the blood, the screams. And the worst part? There was nothing he could do about it, not yet. The leader seemed to notice the shift. His attention snapped to the younger robber, who had become increasingly erratic. The leader's voice was low, almost too calm. "Put the gun down. Put it down now," he said, his hand reaching out slowly as if trying to control the situation with calm words. But the younger man was beyond listening. He was lost in his own panic. Tom's eyes never left the woman. She was still holding her child tightly, trying to shield the little one as best as she could. Her face was white with fear, her eyes wide and full of desperation. Tom couldn't stand it any longer. He had to do something. His hand, still resting near his concealed weapon, itched to move. But he knew that if he pulled it out too soon, if he made the wrong move, it could cost someone their life. Suddenly the unstable robber raised his gun again, his eyes wild. "I said get your hands up," he screamed, this time pointing the barrel straight at the woman and child. Without thinking, Tom moved. He didn't have time to plan or think about the consequences. His mind was on instinct now, the same instinct that had saved his life countless times. He slid his hand under the table, gripping the edge. A split second later, he knocked over the bottle of wine that had been sitting there, sending it crashing to the floor. The loud sound of glass shattering was enough to distract the robbers for just a moment. The younger robber turned, gun raised, but Tom was already on the move. He slid out of his seat, pushing past Jack as he quickly crossed the room toward the bar. His steps were light, calculated. He was trying to make himself as invisible as possible, blending into the chaos. The leader shouted at him, "What the hell do you think you're doing? Get down!" Tom didn't respond. He just kept moving, his eyes scanning the room for anything he could use. His mind was racing. If he could just get close enough, if he could just find a way to get the robbers focused on something else, maybe, just maybe, he could help. He was already calculating his next move. He needed to create more chaos, just enough to throw the robbers off balance. The woman in the corner, her hands still raised in the air, caught Tom's eye again. This time there was no mistake. She was pleading with him, not with words, but with her eyes. She was begging for him to do something. The child was still crying, and Tom could see her fear that she might not make it out of this alive. Tom's heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't afford to think about that. He had to stay focused. The robbers were still too distracted by their own panic to notice him. But he knew that wouldn't last long. He had to act fast. The woman's life, the child's life, and everyone else in the room, they were all depending on him. The tension in the room was palpable. The robbers were all on edge, their nerves frayed, their actions growing more erratic with each passing second. And in that moment, Tom knew he had only one choice. He had to keep the robbers off balance long enough to get the hostages out of harm's way. The next few minutes would make all the difference. The tension in the room grew thicker with every passing second. Tom could feel it, like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. His pulse was racing, his mind moving at 1,000 miles per hour. The robbers, on edge and growing more erratic by the minute, were the unpredictable element now. The leader was still trying to maintain control, but Tom could see his grip was loosening. The unstable one, the younger robber, was the real problem. His eyes were wide, his breath shallow, and his hands were shaking as he waved the gun around the room, completely out of control. Tom's instincts screamed at him to act, but he had to move carefully. The smallest misstep could turn this chaotic scene into a bloodbath. He glanced quickly at Jack, who was still seated, but his face was tense. He wasn't just a passive observer anymore. Jack was thinking too, weighing his own options. Tom knew Jack would never just sit there, but Jack also knew the stakes. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The leader, frustrated by his partner's behavior, snapped at him, his voice tight. "Put the gun down, you idiot! You're making everything worse." The younger robber only muttered something incomprehensible in response, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape route or someone to lash out at. He had clearly lost any sense of strategy. His fear had consumed him. Tom felt the clock ticking. He was getting closer to the bar now, making his way between the scattered tables, trying to stay low, trying to keep his movements smooth. His mind was already running through every possible outcome. He didn't have much time. The robbers were becoming more unpredictable by the second. He could hear their strained voices over the din of the terrified patrons, and their words were only making the situation worse. One of the waiters had tried to make a break for it, darting toward the kitchen. The unstable robber swung his gun toward the fleeing man and fired a shot into the air. Bang! The sharp sound of the shot ricocheted through the room, and the crowd froze. Tom's heart skipped a beat. The bullet hadn't hit anyone, but it didn't matter. The tension was already at its breaking point. The younger robber's wild shooting had just escalated everything. Patrons screamed, ducking under tables, scrambling for cover. One of them, an older man in a gray suit, tripped as he tried to crawl behind a column. His glasses flew off his face as he hit the ground, but no one was in a position to help him. Tom felt the pit of his stomach tighten. He wasn't just worried about the woman and child anymore. Every single person in the restaurant was in danger now. The entire room was a powder keg, and the robbers were the matches. Tom had to figure out how to stop this before things went even further. Through the chaos, his gaze flickered back to the woman in the corner. She was still holding the child, her face stricken with terror. Her eyes were locked on the unstable robber, but she was smart enough to know not to make a move. If she made the wrong one, she could provoke him into pulling the trigger. Tom's eyes narrowed. He could see her struggle, trying to find a way to keep herself and her child safe, but it was clear she had no options. The unstable robber had the upper hand right now, and he wasn't above hurting anyone to get what he wanted. Tom's attention shifted again to the leader. The man seemed to be losing patience, his face growing red as he snapped at his partners. "We need to get out of here now. The plan was simple, all right? Get the money and go. We don't need to kill anyone." But his words didn't seem to calm the situation at all. The unstable robber looked even more agitated, his fingers twitching around the trigger of his gun. "Shut up, man, you don't get it," he shouted, his voice a mix of anger and fear. "We're not getting out of here alive if we don't take some hostages. We need leverage." The leader's eyes widened, his tone turned sharp and desperate. That wasn't part of the plan. But he never finished his sentence. The unstable robber had already turned his gun back to the woman in the corner. He pointed the barrel right at her. "You, get up. I'll take her with me." His voice was cracking with panic, and his hands trembled, but he seemed determined to take control of the situation. The woman didn't move. She froze, eyes wide, mouth slightly open as she mouthed a silent prayer. Everything around Tom seemed to slow down, the way the unstable robber's finger hovered over the trigger, the woman's terror, the child's cries, the low murmur of panic from the rest of the patrons. The moment stretched out, and Tom knew that if he didn't do something right now, the situation would spiral completely out of control. The robbery would stop being a robbery and become something far worse. He took a deep breath, his mind clearing as his training kicked in. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a cop. But he had been in enough dangerous situations to know that timing was everything. He needed to create a distraction, a big one, something that would make the robbers focus on him, not the hostages. His hand slid into his jacket pocket. He pulled out his phone. It wasn't the weapon he had originally planned to use, but it was something. The bar was just a few feet away now, and he could see a bottle of whiskey sitting there. A bottle of whiskey and a glass full of ice resting on the counter. Without thinking twice, Tom tossed his phone onto the floor near the bar. It clattered loudly, and everyone turned their attention toward the sound. As the robbers shifted their focus, Tom made his move. He grabbed the bottle of whiskey, yanked it from the counter, and hurled it at the nearest wall. The glass shattered with a deafening crash. In that instant, all the robbers were momentarily distracted. They whipped their heads toward the noise, momentarily losing track of their hostages. That was all Tom needed. He darted forward, grabbing a nearby metal chair as he went, ready to use it as a shield if needed. The chaotic scene had just shifted in his favor. The robbers were distracted, but for how long? He couldn't afford to waste another second. The game had just changed. The crash of the whiskey bottle against the wall echoed like a thunderclap in the room, sending shockwaves through the panicked crowd. The robbers, momentarily thrown off by the unexpected noise, turned instinctively toward the source of the sound. For those few seconds, the chaos seemed to pause, as if the world itself had taken a breath. Tom's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't let the adrenaline cloud his focus. The moment was fleeting, and he had to capitalize on it. He saw the leader's eyes snap back toward him, narrowing as if trying to understand what had just happened. The younger robber, still holding his gun in a trembling grip, was visibly confused, his gaze darting from Tom to the broken glass on the floor. Tom didn't waste any time. With a swift motion, he lunged forward, using the chair as a shield. The robbers were still disoriented, their attention divided between the noise, the broken glass, and the people they were supposed to be controlling. It was just enough of a distraction to give Tom a chance. His instincts kicked in. He ducked low, using the chair to cover his approach as he made his way across the room. The unstable robber, who had been waving his gun around erratically, turned back just in time to see Tom charging toward him. The look of fear and confusion in the robber's eyes was palpable. But he didn't react fast enough. Tom swung the chair upward, smashing it into the robber's arms, with a force that sent the gun flying across the room. The younger man let out a shocked yell, his grip loosening as he stumbled back. The impact of the blow sent him crashing into one of the tables, knocking it over in the process. The sound of the table crashing to the floor seemed to trigger a chain reaction of panic. Patrons screamed, ducking down again, hiding under tables or behind whatever they could find. But for Tom, there was no going back. The moment of confusion had passed, and the robbers were starting to regain their bearings. He could see the leader's eyes flick to his partner, then back to Tom, weighing the situation. The leader was smart enough to know that he couldn't afford to let this moment slip away. His hand tightened around his gun, ready to make a move. "Don't move, you crazy bastard," the leader shouted, his voice harsh and commanding. He leveled the gun at Tom, but before he could pull the trigger, there was a new sound, the unmistakable clink of glass, the sound of a wine bottle being uncorked. It was coming from the bar. Tom glanced quickly over his shoulder, but there was no time to react. The woman in the corner, still clutching her child, had somehow managed to grab a nearby wine bottle from the bar. She'd broken it over the counter, and in a desperate move, she hurled it directly at the leader. The bottle shattered on impact, sending shards of glass flying through the air. The leader's eyes widened in shock as the alcohol splashed across his shirt, his face suddenly covered in the dark red liquid. The gun trembled in his hand, his grip loosening as he wiped his face, momentarily distracted. It was a small moment of chaos, but in a standoff like this, it was exactly what Tom needed. In the confusion, Tom moved again. He grabbed a nearby napkin dispenser from a table and threw it straight at the unstable robber's head, catching him off guard. The force of the impact knocked the man to the ground, disorienting him further. He landed in a heap, struggling to get back up, but by the time he did, Tom had already reached the leader. With a sharp, controlled motion, Tom struck. He moved with precision, spinning the leader around and slamming him into the wall with a force that took the air out of the man's lungs. The leader's gun flew from his hand, skidding across the floor. Tom didn't stop. He delivered a swift blow to the man's midsection, causing him to double over in pain. The room for a moment seemed to still. The unstable robber was still on the ground, trying to regain his senses. The patrons were frozen, unsure whether to act or wait for Tom to finish what he had started. The woman in the corner still held her child tightly, her eyes locked on Tom with a mixture of awe and relief. But the leader wasn't finished yet. His eyes flared with rage as he struggled to regain his composure. Tom could see the fury burning in the man's gaze. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. "You think you've won, huh?" The leader spat, his voice low and threatening. He reached for something hidden in his jacket, a knife. It was small, but in the wrong hands, deadly. Tom's reflexes kicked in again. He grabbed the nearest object, a bottle of water, and hurled it at the leader's hand. The bottle struck its target, knocking the knife from the man's grip just before he could make a move. The knife skittered across the floor, out of reach. The leader cursed, his face flushed with frustration. He looked at his partner, who was still on the ground, struggling to stand. Tom's eyes flicked back to the woman in the corner, who was still holding her child, her eyes wide with fear but also with hope. She knew the danger wasn't over yet. Tom's mind raced. The robbers were down, but they weren't out. And the woman, she was still in danger. He had only a few moments to make the next move. But just as he took a step toward her, a voice broke through the chaos. A calm, cold voice that sent a chill down his spine. "Move, and she dies." Tom froze. The unstable robber had found his feet, and now he was holding a gun once again, pointing it directly at the woman and child. The tables had turned. The game was far from over. The room went deathly silent. Every eye in the restaurant, whether hiding under tables or crouching behind chairs, was focused on the unstable robber. His wild, panicked gaze shifted from the woman to Tom, his breath ragged as he held the gun at arm's length, aimed directly at the woman and child in the corner. "Don't move!" the unstable robber snarled, his voice trembling with fear and authority all at once. He looked unsteady, but there was a glint in his eye, a dangerous edge that made everyone in the room hold their breath. "If anyone comes near her, I'll shoot." Tom's muscles locked. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he knew better than to act rashly. This wasn't a moment for heroics. The woman and her child were now the priority, and the unstable robber's erratic movements had given him an opening, if he could just figure out how to keep him distracted long enough. The woman, her hands still raised, made no sudden movements. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, but she remained silent, her child still clutching her side, sobbing quietly. Tom could see her eyes, full of panic, yes, but also desperation. She wasn't just scared for her life, she was terrified for her child. Tom's mind raced. He needed to buy time. He couldn't just rush at the man with the gun. There was no telling what the unstable robber might do in his panic. One wrong move, and it would all come crashing down. He looked around the room for anything that could help, anything to shift the odds. Behind him, Jack had moved closer to the bar, his hands raised slightly in a show of compliance. Jack wasn't foolish. He knew Tom was still formulating a plan, and every second mattered now. But Jack also knew the stakes. If Tom couldn't distract the unstable robber, if the man wasn't brought under control soon, everything would spiral out of control. "Listen to me," Tom said, his voice calm but firm, trying to project confidence. He had to remain calm. If he showed any hint of panic, the robber would sense it. "You don't want to do this. You're not a killer." The unstable robber's eyes flashed. He twitched, his hand tightening on the trigger. "Shut up," he yelled, his voice high and shrill. "I've already killed. You don't get it. If I have to, I'll kill her too." The threat hung in the air, and for a moment Tom's stomach twisted. He knew that the robber's words weren't just a bluff. He was too far gone. The fear in the man's eyes was real. He wasn't thinking clearly. Tom kept his voice steady, pushing forward, even though every instinct told him to act. "We can get you out of here. We can get you what you want. But you have to let her go. Let the woman and child go, and we'll figure this out." For a moment, the robber hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the woman, then back to Tom. He seemed to be weighing something in his head. He was scared, no doubt about it. But there was something else in his eyes, something darker. His finger twitched on the trigger. "Don't think I won't do it," the robber snarled, his breath heavy. "You don't know what I'm capable of." Tom took a slow step forward, careful not to make any sudden moves. He could feel the tension in the air, the unbearable stillness of the room. Everyone was holding their breath, praying that Tom would find a way out of this. But Tom wasn't just thinking about the woman and child anymore. His mind was racing, calculating every possible angle. The robber's hand wavered. The gun was still pointed at the woman, but his grip wasn't as steady as it had been earlier. Tom could see that he was reaching the tipping point. This was the moment when he could either lose control entirely or calm himself down and regain some semblance of order. Tom needed to push him toward the second option, just a little longer, until the moment came where he could act decisively. Another tense second passed. Then, as if on cue, Tom's phone rang. The sudden sound cut through the stillness like a knife. Everyone jumped. The unstable robber's hand jerked upward, the gun wavering dangerously toward the woman. "No!" he screamed, a mix of frustration and fear building in his voice. "Shut that damn thing off!" Tom's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't planned for this, but his instincts told him to use it to his advantage. His phone continued ringing, and he slowly reached into his pocket to pull it out, all while keeping his eyes locked on the robber. The unstable man's gaze followed Tom's hand, his finger tightening around the trigger. "Don't!" the robber shouted, panic rising in his voice. "I swear I'll shoot!" But Tom didn't flinch. He pressed the answer button on his phone, his voice calm but louder now. "Hey, it's me. I'm in the middle of something right now," he said, his words casual. like he was taking a call on a normal day. He made sure to sound completely relaxed, as if nothing was wrong. The robber blinked, caught off guard by the nonchalance in Tom's tone. His grip on the gun faltered slightly, and in that small moment, Tom saw his opportunity. "Who is it?" the unstable robber demanded, his voice shaking. "Who's on the phone?" Tom shot a quick glance at Jack, who was now in position behind the bar, silently moving into place. Tom gave him a barely noticeable nod, signaling that the time was approaching. The distraction with the phone was just a few seconds, but it was all he needed. Tom smiled faintly into the phone. "Oh, just an old friend checking in. Don't worry about it." The robber's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching with uncertainty. His attention was on Tom now, distracted just enough that the woman in the corner subtly moved her hand, trying to shield her child more tightly. Tom saw the subtle shift, and his heart raced. She was counting on him. With the unstable robber's attention diverted, Tom made a move. He lunged forward, his speed and precision catching the robber off guard. Before the man could react, Tom had knocked the gun away, sending it skittering across the floor. The unstable robber's eyes widened in shock and disbelief. His body jerked in a last-ditch attempt to regain control, but it was too late. Jack moved in from behind the bar, stepping in with the kind of calculated precision that only years of experience could provide. Tom grabbed the robber's arm, forcing him to the ground, while Jack swiftly disarmed him and pinned him to the floor. "Stay down," Jack said, his voice low and commanding, as he held the robber in place. "It's over." The room, which had been filled with panic just moments before, suddenly fell into a stunned silence. The woman let out a soft sob, her body trembling with relief as she pulled her child closer. Tom looked back at them, his chest still tight with the tension of the moment. But now there was a flicker of hope. They were safe, for now. But Tom knew this was just the beginning. There was still the leader to deal with, and the clock was ticking. As the unstable robber struggled beneath Jack's grip, his body writhing with a mix of fear and anger, the room still held its collective breath. The woman, her child now quiet, hugged the little one tightly to her chest, her eyes never leaving Tom. Relief was palpable on her face, but Tom could see the remnants of fear still flickering in her gaze. The danger wasn't over. Not yet. Tom's eyes flickered toward the leader, who was still on the other side of the room, watching the scene unfold with a cold, calculating gaze. He hadn't moved an inch since Tom had disarmed him earlier. There was something unnerving about the leader's calm demeanor, like a predator assessing the situation before striking. The leader, now standing motionless, suddenly took a step forward. His voice was low, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "You think this is over? You think you've won? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Tom's muscles tensed. The last thing he wanted was another confrontation, but he knew that he couldn't underestimate the leader. If anything, this man had proven to be even more dangerous than his unstable accomplice. The fact that the leader hadn't panicked, hadn't made a single reckless move, meant he was calculating his next step. Jack had a firm grip on the unstable robber, but Tom kept his attention on the leader. The air between them thickened, charged with a volatile mix of hostility and fear. The leader reached into his jacket, slow and deliberate, as if he were trying to gauge Tom's next move. "You don't know what you've just interrupted," he said, his eyes flicking briefly to the woman and child. "You think you're the hero? You're just delaying the inevitable. The clock's ticking, and we're running out of time." Tom felt a sudden chill run down his spine. He knew exactly what the leader was implying. There was something bigger going on here, something that neither of them had accounted for. If the leader had a backup plan, it was likely already set in motion. Tom couldn't let his guard down, not for a second. The leader pulled something out of his pocket. A small device, something that looked like a remote control. Tom's heart skipped a beat. "You really think this is about money, don't you?" The leader chuckled as he turned the device in his hand. "You're about to find out what happens when you mess with the wrong people." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The room was silent, save for the soft, distant whimper of a child. The device in the leader's hand glowed ominously, casting a strange, flickering light across his face. Tom instinctively stepped forward, his hand reaching for his own weapon, but before he could make a move, the leader pressed a button. Nothing happened. Tom froze, eyes wide. His mind raced. The leader had clearly expected some kind of reaction. Instead, the device remained dead. His expression shifted from one of cold confidence to something darker, almost disappointed. Then, with a sharp, venomous laugh, the leader tossed the device aside. "Foolish," he muttered, shaking his head. "I should have known it was too good to be true." It was a bluff. The leader had been trying to manipulate them all along. The device wasn't wired to anything. It was a tool to create fear, to distract them while he figured out his next move. But now that the ruse had failed, Tom could see the man's frustration boiling over. This wasn't someone who would let failure slide. Tom knew that they couldn't afford to let this man regain control, not now. The leader was unpredictable, and as long as he was still breathing, he posed a serious threat. Before Tom could react, the leader took a quick step back, glancing at his accomplice on the ground. His cold eyes locked with Tom's. "You think you've won, but you're just in the way of something much bigger. You don't have a clue what's coming." "But you will," the leader hissed, his voice growing colder. "You'll all regret this." With that, the leader turned and bolted toward the exit. Tom didn't hesitate. He sprang into action, but the leader was fast, too fast. He ducked behind a pillar near the door, disappearing into the darkened alley outside. Tom cursed under his breath. He couldn't risk letting the leader slip away, not now. "Stay here," Tom commanded, turning to Jack, who had secured the unstable robber. "Keep him under control. I'll take care of this." Jack nodded grimly, his eyes narrowing as he held the robber down with an iron grip. "Be careful, Tom. We don't know what else he's got up his sleeve." Tom didn't need the warning. He was already on the move. Tom didn't wait for another second. He bolted out the door and into the alley, his mind focused entirely on one thing: the leader. He could hear footsteps echoing in the distance, fast and uneven, as the man made his escape. The alley was narrow and dimly lit, but Tom didn't hesitate. His legs moved as if they were on autopilot, every muscle in his body focused on one goal: stopping the leader before it was too late. He rounded a corner, the cold air biting at his skin, and saw the leader ahead, darting between two dumpsters. The man wasn't even trying to be stealthy anymore. He was running out of options. Tom's pulse quickened. He was closing the gap. But then, something caught his eye, a glint of light reflecting off a metal object near the far end of the alley. The leader was reaching into his jacket again. Tom's instincts screamed at him to stop, to stay low and wait for the perfect moment, but the leader had already pulled something out. A gun. Tom's heart raced as the man leveled the weapon toward him. For a split second, time seemed to slow. Tom didn't have a weapon, only his bare hands and sheer will. But he wasn't about to back down now. The leader smirked, his finger hovering over the trigger. "You're too late," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You'll never stop it. It's already started." Tom didn't wait for him to finish. With a roar, he charged forward, ducking as the first shot rang out, the bullet barely missing his shoulder. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the narrow alley as Tom closed the distance. He wasn't going to let the leader get away. Not now. In a blur of movement, Tom reached the leader just as he tried to fire again. The gunshot missed, the bullet embedding itself into the brick wall next to Tom's head. Tom grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it with all his strength. The leader grunted in pain, but his grip on the gun remained tight. Tom didn't give him a chance to recover. With a sharp twist, he slammed the leader's arm against the wall, forcing the gun from his hand. The leader's eyes blazed with fury, but Tom was relentless. He could feel the man's breath hot against his skin as he slammed a knee into his midsection, knocking the wind out of him. The leader staggered back, gasping for air. But Tom wasn't finished. He grabbed the man by the collar and lifted him off the ground, pushing him into the cold, unforgiving brick wall. "This ends now," Tom said through gritted teeth, his voice cold as steel. The leader's defiance faltered for a moment, but there was something else in his eyes now. Fear. Fear of being caught, of losing everything. "You're right," the leader spat, his voice dripping with venom. "It ends now, but you're still too late. You're all too late." Tom's grip tightened. But before he could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder by the second. The police were closing in. Tom looked down at the defeated leader, his expression hard. The chase was over. For now. But Tom couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger. As the police arrived, the first thing they did was take control. Officers swarmed into the alley, their guns drawn. But Tom held up his hands in a gesture of calm. The leader was already handcuffed and being read his rights, his eyes dark with resentment as he was shoved into the back of a patrol car. Tom stood to the side, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. His pulse was still racing, his body humming with adrenaline, but the immediate danger had passed. The chaos in the restaurant, the high-stakes standoff, the chase through the alley, everything had unfolded so quickly, and now, for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a moment of quiet. Jack, still standing by the restaurant door, gave Tom a nod of approval. The unstable robber was already being loaded into another police car, handcuffed and defeated, his earlier bravado now completely gone. He was a broken man, crumpled and frail in the face of Tom's resolve. The mission was done, the immediate threat neutralized. Tom walked back to the entrance of the restaurant, his steps heavy but purposeful. He glanced around at the patrons who had been hiding. Some were standing cautiously, peeking out from behind tables, others still shaking with fear. The woman and her child were standing together near the bar, their faces pale but safe. The relief was visible on their faces, and Tom couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride for having helped them. The woman caught his eye and mouthed a silent, "Thank you." Her gratitude was more than just words. It was in the way her shoulders seemed to relax, the way her child no longer clung to her in fear. Tom offered a small, reassuring smile before turning toward the officer who was now approaching him. "Good work, Mr. Cruz," the officer said, his voice low but appreciative. "We've got this from here. We'll need a statement from you, but you've done your part." Tom nodded, acknowledging the compliment. "Of course, just make sure you check the guy's background. I don't think this was just a robbery." The officer raised an eyebrow, but Tom didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The tension in the air, the odd way the leader had spoken, his cryptic words, it all gnawed at Tom's mind. There was something about this situation that didn't sit right. Robbery gone wrong or not, the leader's words had been full of hidden meaning. And Tom knew better than to ignore that kind of intuition. "We'll take it from here," the officer said again, and Tom could hear the unspoken implication in his tone. "We'll investigate further." It was the kind of casual dismissal that only a cop could deliver, but Tom didn't take offense. He'd done his part. He'd kept the situation from escalating, from turning into something much worse. As the police began their work, Tom stepped outside into the cool evening air. His mind was spinning. Despite everything that had happened, there was still a nagging feeling in his gut. The leader's words had echoed in his head. "Too late. You're all too late." And now, standing in the darkened alley, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he had only uncovered the smallest fraction of something far more sinister. The evening had started out as a simple dinner, a quiet evening out. But what had begun as a robbery had turned into something much bigger, much more dangerous. Tom rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the exhaustion that was creeping up on him. But the feeling remained. Something had been set in motion tonight, and the worst part was, he didn't know exactly what it was yet. A voice broke through his thoughts. "Tom!" Jack called from the door. He was standing just outside the restaurant, his posture tense, his eyes scanning the street. Tom turned and walked toward him. Jack's expression was hard, his jaw clenched. He didn't look like he had any more answers than Tom did. But there was something in his eyes, something that suggested he was thinking the same thing. "The police are doing their thing," Jack said, glancing over his shoulder at the officers. "But I've been going over the leader's file while we were waiting for backup." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Already?" Jack gave him a tight nod. He wasn't just some random guy. This wasn't his first job. His name's Marcus Graves. Has a record of ties to some shady groups. Nothing concrete, but enough to raise an eyebrow. The guy's been on the radar for a while. Tom felt a chill run through him. Ties to what kind of groups? Jack's eyes narrowed. The kind that doesn't do small-time robberies. I think we've only scratched the surface of what's going on here, Tom. Graves was just the tip of the iceberg. Tom didn't say anything for a long moment. He could feel his gut twisting, that nagging feeling growing stronger. Something bigger was coming. He just didn't know what it was yet. But he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next few days were a blur. The aftermath of the robbery was still being pieced together by the police, but the reports were coming back with more questions than answers. Tom had been debriefed multiple times, giving his statement, recounting every detail of the incident. The officers were impressed, and he knew they appreciated his quick thinking, but they were also puzzled by one thing: the leader's cryptic comments before his capture. "Too late, you're all too late." Tom couldn't shake those words. The leader hadn't acted like someone desperate for money. The way he spoke suggested there was something else at play, a bigger agenda, something that went far beyond the robbery. But the police couldn't find anything that tied Graves to a larger criminal organization. There was nothing solid, no direct link. And yet, Tom could feel it in his bones. He spent the next few days digging into Marcus Graves's background himself. Without directly involving the police, who were still handling their own investigation, he reached out to some of his old contacts. The people who owed him favors, the kinds of people who could find answers where official channels couldn't. What he uncovered disturbed him more than he expected. Graves wasn't just a small-time criminal. He was tied to a network of underground operatives with a wide reach. His associates had their hands in everything from smuggling and arms trading to cybercrime. And as Tom dug deeper, he discovered a trail of money laundering operations that stretched across several continents. This wasn't just about a failed robbery, it was about something far bigger. It was then that Tom stumbled upon a lead, a mysterious figure who seemed to be pulling the strings behind Graves. A man known only by the alias, the Broker. The Broker was untouchable, a ghost. No one had ever seen him, and no one knew who he really was. But Graves had been in contact with him, according to intercepted communications that Tom had managed to get his hands on. The Broker was connected to every major criminal operation that Tom had uncovered, and that meant he was the key. Tom didn't know how, but he knew that the robbery, the one he had stopped so quickly, was only the beginning. The Broker was planning something bigger, and Tom had just stepped into a web far more dangerous than he could have imagined. The real fight was only just beginning, and Tom was determined to stop it, no matter what the cost. Tom's obsession with the mysterious Broker grew by the hour. He had always been the kind of man who trusted his instincts. His gut had never let him down. And right now, everything in his gut told him that the Broker was the key to understanding what was really going on. The problem was, there was nothing concrete to go on. The Broker was as elusive as smoke, leaving no traces, no patterns, and no face. The few people who had come close to him had vanished without a trace, and no one dared speak his name out loud for fear of what might happen. But Tom had never been one to back down from a challenge. With his connections in the intelligence world, Tom was able to scrape together a partial profile of the Broker. The most disturbing part? His involvement wasn't limited to one geographical area. The Broker had orchestrated high-stakes heists, financial collapses, and covert operations all around the world, and his fingerprints were found in everything from black market arms deals to cyber attacks on major financial institutions. The level of sophistication in his operations was mind-boggling. Whoever this man was, he was playing a dangerous game on an international scale, and Tom now found himself thrust right into the middle of it. In a last-ditch effort to make sense of things, Tom contacted one of his old informants, someone with connections to the underground criminal networks who had been helpful in the past. She was a former hacker-turned-whistleblower, known only by her code name, Echo. She had a way of getting into places that others couldn't. If anyone could help Tom dig into the broker's operations, it was her. He met Echo at a small, nondescript cafe on the outskirts of town. Her short black hair was tucked under a baseball cap, and her face was partially obscured by dark sunglasses. She was always careful, always cautious, but when she saw Tom, her expression softened, and she gestured for him to sit. "You've got a lot of questions, Cruz," she said with a knowing smile, sipping from a cup of coffee, "and from the look on your face, none of them are getting answered." Tom slid a folder across the table. It was filled with intelligence reports, intercepted communications, and financial records that linked Graves to the shadowy network. Echo glanced at the folder, then back at him. "You're in deep now, aren't you? And you still don't know the full picture." Tom leaned in, his voice low. "What can you tell me about the broker?" Her eyes flickered with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "You're not the first person to ask that. But I'm going to warn you. This is a rabbit hole you don't want to go down. The broker is untouchable for a reason. If you try to expose him, you'll make a lot of enemies, and not just the kind you can handle." Echo paused as though she were weighing her options. Finally she spoke, her tone more serious now. "You're right to be concerned. The broker runs a global network. It's not just about money or power, it's about control. He manipulates governments, corporations, and criminal organizations alike. People think he's a ghost, but trust me, Cruz, he's everywhere. He's always one step ahead." Tom's mind was reeling. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by Echo felt like a punch to the gut. "What does he want?" Echo's voice dropped even lower. "Chaos. He thrives on it. The broker is an architect of disorder. He doesn't care about the specifics. He creates instability and watches the world burn. And right now, he's building something big, a scheme that's going to make everything you've seen so far look like child's play." The weight of her words hit Tom like a ton of bricks. He had been playing a small part in a much larger game, one that could change everything. "Where do I find him?" Echo didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slid a small encrypted USB drive across the table. "This has everything you need. Names, locations, transactions, all tied to the broker's operations. But I'm warning you, Tom, you're walking into a lion's den. The broker won't hesitate to wipe out anyone who gets too close to his plans." Tom picked up the USB drive, his fingers cold as ice. "I can handle it," he said, determination flooding his veins. Echo didn't look convinced, but she simply nodded. "You better. And just remember, there's no going back after this. If you dig too deep, the broker won't just come for you, he'll come for everyone you care about." Tom pocketed the USB, giving Echo a final nod before standing up. He didn't have time to dwell on her warnings. He had a lead, and he wasn't going to waste it. The broker's shadow had fallen over everything, and now it was time to find out what the man was really after. Tom spent the next few days decrypting the files on the USB drive. What he uncovered was more disturbing than anything he had imagined. The scope of the broker's operations was staggering. There were ties to organized crime syndicates in Europe, cartel activity in South America, and shady financial dealings in the Middle East. But the most alarming part? A list of names. High-profile individuals who had somehow been manipulated or blackmailed into doing the broker's bidding. Politicians, CEOs, powerful businessmen. And in the middle of it all, Marcus Graves had been nothing more than a pawn. One of the names on the list stood out above the rest. Victor Halloran. A tech mogul whose company controlled a vast majority of global data networks. He was known for his ruthless business practices and his connections to governments and corporations worldwide. If anyone could help the broker orchestrate a global disruption, it was Halloran. Tom's investigation quickly zeroed in on Halloran's operations, and he discovered something terrifying. Halloran had been working on a top-secret project, a new form of encryption software that could, in theory, control entire nations' data networks. If it fell into the wrong hands, it could bring the global economy to its knees, shutting down power grids, communication systems, and critical infrastructure across the world. And it was the broker, who had been pulling the strings from the shadows, ensuring that Halloran's project was completed on time. Tom knew he had to act fast. The clock was ticking, and if the broker was this close to unleashing his plan, the consequences would be catastrophic. Halloran's company was located in a highly secure facility in the heart of the city, a fortress, both physically and digitally. It was time to go in. Alone. Tom had no choice but to rely on his skills. He couldn't afford to involve the police or the government. Too many people were already compromised. This was a covert operation, and he had only one chance to stop whatever the broker was planning. He spent the night preparing, gathering equipment, and strategizing his infiltration. The plan was simple: break into Halloran's facility, extract any data related to the encryption project, and take down anyone who got in his way. No room for mistakes. As the night drew closer, Tom's mind was racing. The weight of everything, his past decisions, his responsibility to those he had saved, the lives that would be ruined if the broker's plan succeeded, all of it felt like a heavy cloak around him. But there was no turning back. The storm was coming, and Tom Cruise was about to walk right into the heart of it. The night was still and thick with tension as Tom prepared for what would be his most dangerous mission yet. The facility housing Victor Halloran's encryption project was a high-security compound, one that few had ever breached without a clear death sentence. But Tom had no other choice. The broker's plans had already moved from the theoretical to the imminent. If he didn't act now, the global disruption would be unstoppable. As he approached the building, Tom couldn't help but notice how eerily quiet everything felt. It was almost too easy, too still. But he pushed the feeling aside. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and they told him to keep moving forward. The security outside the facility was formidable, but Tom had the right tools. His hands worked quickly, manipulating the lock with precision. In moments, he was inside, moving through the shadows, his mind laser-focused on the task at hand. He knew Halloran's project was housed deep within the facility, in a heavily guarded data center. But there was one problem. Halloran's company wasn't just about data, it was about power, and controlling that power meant controlling the world's digital heartbeat. Tom moved silently through the corridors, staying low and staying out of sight. His heart was pounding, but he didn't let the fear take hold. The lights flickered as he navigated through the building, and he could feel the weight of every step. He wasn't just breaking into a tech mogul's fortress. He was walking into the lion's den, the lair of someone who could easily make a global disaster happen with a few keystrokes. Just as he reached the door to the data center, an alarm blared. His pulse spiked, but he didn't hesitate. He had expected it. The entire facility had been rigged to respond to unauthorized access. As the guards scrambled to close in on his position, Tom worked with speed and efficiency, hacking into the system using his own tools. The doors to the data center slid open, and Tom stepped inside. Rows upon rows of servers stretched before him, a glowing sea of technology, each one a vital part of Halloran's system. But Tom didn't waste time admiring the impressive setup. He needed the encrypted data, the key to shutting down the broker's plan. With the data transfer underway, the sound of footsteps grew louder, the security team closing in. Tom knew his time was running out. He grabbed the encrypted file. He had everything he needed, but as he turned to make his escape, he found himself face to face with none other than Victor Halloran himself. The tech mogul, tall and imposing, stood with a cold smile, flanked by two armed guards. "Well, well," Halloran said, his voice dripping with amusement. "Tom Cruise, the famous hero, I've been expecting you." Tom didn't flinch, though every muscle in his body screamed for action. He couldn't allow himself to be distracted. He was so close. But Halloran wasn't alone, and he knew it. The broker's influence was everywhere. "You've made a huge mistake," Tom said, his voice low and steady. "You're not the one pulling the strings. The broker is, and when his plan hits, everything you've built will come crashing down." Halloran's smile never faltered. "You think I don't know that? The broker and I have been partners for a long time. You have no idea what's coming, Cruz. You're too late. Before Tom could respond, the guards advanced, weapons raised. But he was faster. He threw himself into a roll, narrowly avoiding a bullet that whizzed past his head. The chaos had begun. Tom fired first, taking out one of the guards with precision. The second guard lunged at him, but Tom was already on the move, his body a blur as he evaded the attack. He kicked the guard in the chest, sending him crashing into a row of servers. With one swift motion, Tom disarmed the man, knocking him unconscious. The fight was over almost as quickly as it had begun. But Halloran wasn't finished. "You think this is over? You're already too late," he sneered, backing away toward a hidden panel in the wall. His fingers flew across the buttons, and Tom's heart sank as he realized what Halloran was about to do. "He's activated the failsafe," Tom muttered to himself, sprinting forward. Just as Halloran was about to complete the final sequence, Tom reached him. In one fluid motion, Tom grabbed Halloran's wrist, twisting it until the man cried out in pain. Halloran dropped the remote control, but it was too late. The countdown had begun. Tom didn't hesitate. He crushed the device underfoot, but the damage had been done. The clock was ticking, and Halloran's system had been compromised. They were running out of time. Tom didn't need to look at the timer to know how much trouble they were in. The failsafe had triggered, sending the encrypted systems into lockdown, cutting off access to the servers that controlled the encryption software. Worse yet, Halloran's expression had gone from smug superiority to something darker, something more dangerous. "You don't get it, do you?" Halloran sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You think stopping me means stopping the broker. But you're just playing into his hands. This was never about the software. This is just a distraction. The broker has bigger plans, plans that you can't even begin to understand." Tom's mind raced. A distraction? A momentary flicker of panic threatened to break his concentration, but he quickly regained his focus. The timer was counting down rapidly now, and if he didn't act fast, he would be trapped in this facility with Halloran when everything came crashing down. But there was still something that didn't sit right in his gut. He knew Halloran was hiding something. "What's really going on, Halloran?" Tom asked, his voice cold and commanding. "You're not telling me everything. What's the broker's real plan?" Halloran's smirk faltered just for a second, before his face hardened into a mask of defiance. "You'll never know. You're too late. The broker's plan is already in motion. You're already a pawn in his game." Tom wasn't buying it. Halloran was panicking, and people only panic when they're about to lose control. Just then the facility's emergency alarms went off and the lights flickered ominously. Tom glanced up, his heart skipping a beat as he saw something that confirmed his worst fear. The facility's mainframe was linked to a secondary location, a much larger hub, one that had been hidden in plain sight. And that hub wasn't just connected to Halloran's servers. It was connected to every global system controlled by the broker. The truth hit him like a freight train. The encryption software, the entire project. It was never meant to control just Halloran's company. It was a key to unlock every financial, military, and technological system around the world. Halloran had been the distraction. The broker was the mastermind behind the real operation. And now, Tom had to stop it before it was too late. Time was running out. Tom had seconds to make a choice. Halloran's face twisted into an expression of manic triumph. "You're too late, Cruz," he said, his voice sharp. "The broker's already one step ahead. No matter what you do, you're not going to stop it." Tom's mind raced, but he didn't waste another second. With a final glance at Halloran, Tom turned and bolted for the central terminal. He could feel the weight of the moment on his shoulders. If he didn't shut down the system now, global chaos would follow. Every piece of infrastructure connected to the system was about to be compromised. He reached the terminal just as the countdown hit 0. Sweat trickled down his face, his heart pounding in his chest as he input the emergency override codes he had managed to retrieve from Echo's encrypted files. It was a gamble, but it was the only chance they had. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the system began to shut down. The lights flickered back on, and the alarms ceased. Tom breathed a sigh of relief, but the victory felt hollow. The broker had been stopped, at least for now. But Tom knew better than anyone that a single operation like this could never be eradicated overnight. The broker's network was too vast, too powerful. As the authorities rushed in to secure the facility, Tom made his way to the exit, his mind already planning the next steps. The broker was still out there, and as long as he was alive, Tom would never stop hunting him. This wasn't just about stopping one man, it was about stopping an entire network of corruption, an unseen force that could bring the world to its knees. And Tom Cruise wasn't going to rest until the broker was taken down for good. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun.